Hello and welcome to Week 7 of Baptist History and Distinctives. You'll want to refer to slides 367 through 461 in this study. And in this study, we'll be looking at Baptist in America after 1845 all the way to modern Baptists today in the 21st century. So this will be the concluding week of the course, and you'll be studying from just before the Civil War up until the modern period in which we are in. As we mentioned in our last video, the division of a Baptist in America in 1845 was very profound and was one of the most critical events in American Baptist history. Baptists prior to 1845 had come together, had unified there in the early 19th century. There was a sense of unity. There was this unity that came together over missions, and the Triennial Convention was formed. Baptists became concerned about foreign missions. Baptists in America became concerned about home missions. They came together serving the Lord. They were unified as one body in that early 19th century period. And then in 1845, a very profound event occurred, and that was a cleavage, a division among Baptists over the issue of slavery that took place in America, which would, in just a few years, lead to the American Civil War, one of the greatest and most pivotal events in American history, which actually has shaped America into the country that it is today. Many of the things that we do today in America, many of the ways that we live today in America are shaped by the American Civil War and the outcome of the American Civil War. So a very important time, not only in the nation's history in terms of how it defined our country and what we believe in practice today, but also in church history, in particular Baptist history. Prior to 1845, Baptists are pretty united, and they're working together for missions. They have a vision for missions. They're evangelizing the world. They're evangelizing America. They're unified, and then comes 1845, and this cleavage in America over the issue of slavery. And I want you to remember that year and remember that change there. It's very important in American history. And what you see occurring in 1845 is the division of Baptists between two major groups. Baptist in the North, which became eventually known in the early 20th century as Northern Baptist Convention, and Baptist in the South, which became known as the Southern Baptist Convention. So this major split between the Baptists, the North and the South, each developing their own individual organizations, missions programs, schools, things like that. Each area of those two groups would establish their own organizations, own mission groups, and own ways of doing things. So very important, very pivotal in the history of Baptist in America, which continues to this very day. And the slavery was the key issue that did that. So be aware of what happened in 1845 and why it happened. I want you to be aware of what caused this split among Baptists in America. And it had to do with the issue of the Northern Baptist due to conscience not feeling right about ordaining missionaries from the South that owned slaves. And over that very issue, the Southern Baptists, who did own slaves, many of them, felt like that should not be an issue in missions, should not be a factor in the sending out of missionaries, and therefore they couldn't cooperate with these Northern Baptists who felt that way, and they withdrew and formed their own group and their own organizations. So be aware of that and be conscious of that. And so Baptist organizations were formed. The Baptist missions became very big among Baptist women. You have the formation of the American Baptist Publication Society. Publications began to be published in America, and Christian literature became very popular. We mentioned the tract movement, how that was popular. Sunday school literature began to be published among Baptists, and much of this literature was dispensed to people, and people would read this. It was a great way to evangelize, and still is. I'm all for the tract movement and passing out tracts and Christian literature. The American Baptist Home Mission Society was formed and was involved in home missions and establishing missions here in the country. And there were missions among different ethnic groups here in America, from immigrants that had come, such as Germans, Scandinavians, French, Chinese, and other groups. There also became emphasis on education. Schools and seminaries developed in the 19th century among Baptists to educate our Baptist people and Baptist leaders and ministers. The American Baptist Education Society was formed in Washington, D.C. In some very famous schools in our country that we are aware of now that are now secular were actually founded as Baptist schools, such as the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is a very liberal school. It would probably classify itself today as a secular school. That was founded as a Baptist school. And many of the schools that are famous in the country were founded as Baptist schools. And here's a picture of the original home campus of the University of Chicago in Chicago, very famous for its high educational standards, its departments of science, particularly physics. Some of our nuclear scientists were educated, excuse me, at the University of Chicago. Now, in the South, after 1845, when the Baptists split, the Baptists formed the Foreign Mission Board in order to conduct missions, which is very important, which is still very active and effective even to this day. So be familiar with the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board. And some of their most famous pioneer missionaries were people such as Lottie Moon, who became a very famous missionary to China. And here's a good picture of Lottie, a very wonderful woman of God. And Southern Baptists to this day use Lottie's name over their mission fund to raise funds for missions, and it's named after her. She was a pioneer Southern Baptist missionary, one of their first missionaries, and missionary to China. Very, very wonderful lady. She and her sister was involved in missions too. Be aware of that and how the women were involved, such as the Women's Missionary Union. And when it was formed, be aware of that. Annie Armstrong, again, another person that worked in missions. And the Lottie Moon Christmas offering for foreign missions is taken every year by the Southern Baptists, and that fund has raised more than $500 million to date for foreign missions. The Southern Baptists have been able to raise a lot of money with their annual Christmas offering in the name of Lottie Moon, which they distribute to their missionaries. The Southern Baptists have had a lot of mission work among domestic missions, and they have a home mission board which has done a lot of mission work. It's been headquartered in Atlanta. One of the key leaders in home missions among Southern Baptists was Isaac Tickner. And be familiar with him. He was secretary of the Home Mission Board, and very wonderful, godly man, promoted missions, home missions, and education. He also was instrumental in education in the Southern Baptist, among the Southern Baptists, and helping form the first Southern Baptist seminary, and that's Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. It was formed in 1859 in Greenville, South Carolina. The Southern Baptist Board of Sunday Schools was formed, became known as the Sunday School Board to promote Sunday school study and literature, a very famous organization. Here's a very nice picture of Isaac Tickner, who was a key founder, educator of home missions and education among the Southern Baptists in the mid-19th century, so be familiar with Isaac Tickner. Also, others such as James Marion Frost were involved in the formation of the Southern Baptist School Board. The first Baptist college in the South was founded in Edgefield, South Carolina in 1825 at the meeting of the Baptist State Convention of South Carolina. That school later moved to Greenville, South Carolina in 1851 and is named today Furman University, which is a very well-known university in the United States. I've had the privilege to visit Furman myself a couple of times. Very beautiful campus down in Greenville, South Carolina. It has a big old lake right in the middle of the campus and just a beautiful facility. One thing about the Southern Baptist, they have always spent a lot of money on their schools, and their campuses, their schools and buildings are just phenomenal. Just beautiful facilities, and Furman is one of those schools. So, you can visit that down in Greenville, South Carolina. Other schools formed are like Georgetown College in Kentucky, Wake Forest here in North Carolina, our own Wake Forest University, which originated as a Baptist school. Southern Baptist School, Samford University in Alabama, the University of Richmond, Carson Newman College, Baylor University in Texas. All of these were founded in the 19th century as Southern Baptist institutions of education. And we mentioned the seminaries. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is the pioneer seminary among Southern Baptists, and it was founded in April 30th, 1858 in Greenville, South Carolina. James P. Boyce was chairman of the faculty, and you had famous Southern Baptist faculty members that you may have heard of, such as John Broadus, who was famous for his homiletics and instruction in preaching, Basil Manley Jr., and William Williams and others. A.T. Robertson was one of the early Southern Baptist educators, a famous Greek professor. These men were involved in early Baptist education in America, particularly here in the South. Another very important movement that I want you to study and be familiar with this week is the movement known as Landmark Baptist. And that movement, here's a nice picture of the home campus of the administrative building of Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Very beautiful place. I've had the privilege to visit Southern Seminary once, and a very beautiful campus. Fantastic library, one of the best libraries I've ever seen, and a very beautiful campus. I encourage you to visit there if you have the chance. Here's one of the early professors of Southern Seminary, James Boyce, preaching professor John Broadus. Good picture of him, which you'll see in your slides. And now let's talk a little bit about the Landmark movement. The Landmark movement is a movement that arose among Baptists in the South, and the key founder of the Landmark movement was J.R. Graves, and he's called the father of Landmarkism. And Graves published a Baptist newspaper called the Tennessee Baptist. He was a pastor in Tennessee. And he published a very widely circulated Baptist paper that became very popular. And Graves and other landmarkers believed that Baptist churches were the only true churches and that all other churches were human societies without valid ministers and ordinances. And the Landmark Baptists preached that churches should go back to the old landmarks. That's where they get their name. Churches should go back to the old landmarks that established the faith like in the early days of the apostles and the days of the early church. And here's a good picture of Graves, the key founder of the Landmark Baptist movement. He became a pastor in Nashville, Tennessee, and pastored there a number of years, published his newspaper, and promoted landmark ideas. And the Landmark movement, let's talk about, first of all, be familiar with the 6 tenets of landmarkism, what the landmark believers believe, that Baptist churches are the only true churches in the world, that the true church is a local, visible church institution. There's a strong emphasis among Landmark Baptists about the local church. And you've probably heard that. I've heard that around here at Piedmont in my days as a student here. There was a constant talk about the local church. Well, that emphasis comes to a certain degree from the landmarks and what Landmark Baptists have promoted over the past 100 years. Very strong emphasis on the local church. And I believe in the local church too. Don't misunderstand me, but they didn't believe in the universal church. They believed that the church existed only as the local church. And they believe that the churches in the kingdom of God are coterminous. They believe that there could be no pulpit affiliation with non-Baptists. You couldn't preach fellowship with other non-Baptists of your stripe. If they didn't believe like you shouldn't preach with them or participate with them. They believe that only the Baptist church, a Landmark Baptist church, can perform proper acts such as baptism, Lord's Supper, preaching, etc. So therefore, it wasn't biblical unless it was being done in a Landmark Baptist church, these ordinances. And they believe that preaching outside the Baptist churches was merely speeches. It wasn't really preaching. So they had this very narrow view of what constituted a New Testament church and what was a proper church, and that is they believed that only the Landmark Baptists were true, visible churches. Anything outside of them was not a valid church. And it's amazing the influence that movement had in America in the 19th and the 20th century, particularly in the late 19th century and going into the 20th century. That movement spread across the South It spread across states like Texas. It caused a big division in Texas, which you can read about. And that movement's had a profound effect. Matter of fact, that movement has had a strong influence in North Carolina. And we have people today, we have pastors and churches today that teach and promote landmark views and feel like that, if you're not a Baptist church just exactly like us, and do exactly what we say and do and practice just like we do, you're not a valid church. You're not a New Testament church. You might be a society, you might be some people that get together, but you're not a valid New Testament church. And that influence is still felt to this very day and has been for over 100 years. And Landmarks believed also that Baptist churches have always existed in every age by an unbroken historical succession. They believed that they were successors to the church that started even in the days of John the Baptist and days of the apostles, since Jesus and the apostles. And it's very influential. So be familiar with the Landmark Baptist. Now let's talk a little bit about the Northern Baptist and their growth in America after 1900. And we're coming more now into the modern period, and you'll want to study that in your notes. Northern Baptist entered the 20th century with a great deal of optimism and idealism after 1900. Their growth in the 19th century had been excellent. Things were happening in the country that contributed to that growth. And things were going well. And what they did after they split with the Southern Baptist in 1845 is they came together and actually formed themselves into a northern organization known as the Northern Baptist Convention, being founded in 1908. So be familiar with the Northern Baptist Convention and the year they were founded. And later they changed their name. They became known later as the American Baptist Convention in 1950, and in 1972 they changed their name to the American Baptist Churches USA, of which they are known today. Now they call themselves the American Baptist. And I've actually visited an American Baptist church in Ohio. Interestingly enough, that's fundamental, still is fundamental. It's one of the few in the Northern Convention that still is, but it is. Interesting thing about the formation of the Northern Baptist as in contrast to the Southern Baptist. The Northern Baptist, when they were formed in 1908, had a liberal bent from the beginning. It's kind of interesting, both in their organization and in their schools and in their missions. They were ecumenical from the beginning. They liked and the ecumenical movement appealed to them. They joined the Federal Council of Churches, which later became the National Council of Churches, and we all know how liberal that organization is. And so they became involved also with liberal missionaries coming into as their missionaries from the Northern Baptist Convention. And they moved, their schools began to drift into liberalism, like the University of Chicago. University of Chicago, actually, from the moment of its founding, was founded basically as a liberal school. Their school in Rochester, New York, Colgate, began teaching liberalism very early. So, they start out as a liberal organization with liberal schools, liberal mission board, liberal educational institutions, liking the ecumenical movement, being a part of the ecumenical movement, people within the Northern Baptist Convention adopting higher criticism and the liberal approach to scriptures and Christianity. So they basically started out in the early 20th century as a liberal group. They got involved in a movement called the New World Movement that was involved in missions, but it was involved with ecumenical missions, and again, they did tolerate liberals within the organization. And there were fundamentalists within the Northern Baptist Convention that were alarmed by that and began to react to that in the early 20th century. Men like William Bell Riley, which I want you to be familiar with him and some of these leaders and how he played a part in being a conservative voice against the liberalism that was going on in the Northern Baptist Convention. George Foster, who taught liberalism there at the University of Chicago, he was teaching that there were two types of Christ, two different Christs, a theological Christ and a historical Christ. They were, two different kinds of Christ. That was liberalism being taught there early in the University of Chicago by Professor Foster, and Riley and fundamentalist men like him reacted against this. This is a good picture of Riley late in his life as pastor there in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then you had liberal professors like Walter Rauschenbusch, the father of the social gospel, who believed that the essence of the gospel was making society better through liberal work in a society and making people better economically and socially, materially in the world. And Rauschenbusch was a Baptist, and he was a professor at Rochester Theological Seminary. So here we have a professor early on in the 19th century in Rochester, New York, teaching liberal ideas and thought, Walter Rauschenbusch. Good picture of Rauschenbusch here. Then you have Professor Augustus Strong, who is considered as a conservative, but it's interesting that he believed in evolution and higher criticism of the Bible, the man who wrote Strong's Systematic Theology, who was president of Rochester Theological Seminary and tolerated Rauschenbusch and other liberal professors there. As a reaction to this, there were conservative seminaries founded, such as Northern Baptist Theological Seminary in 1913, as a reaction to the liberal movement in the Northern Baptist Convention. Here's a picture of Dr. Strong, Professor Strong, who wrote the famous Strong's Theology of the Bible. And there were other good men in the Northern Baptist Convention that fought against liberalism, such as John Roach Stratton, Frank Goodchild, and J.C. Massey. And these men struggled against that. There was a very famous publication which was written and published back in 1920 called The Fundamentals, and that term became the term to the label for people that believed in a conservative Orthodox view of the Bible. They became known as fundamentalists. Curtis Lee Laws, who was an editor of the Watchman Examiner newspaper, wrote an editorial after the Convention of Buffalo in 1920, Northern Baptist Convention, and he used the term fundamentalist to refer to those who were orthodox and fundamental and believed literally in the Bible and the traditional Orthodox doctrines of the Christian faith. And that's where we got the term fundamentalist, which we use to this day. It was coined by Curtis Lee Laws, spawned by the publication of the Fundamentals, in which the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith were listed and described. So be familiar with that, where the term fundamentalism came from. As conservative men like William Bell Riley and Stratton and these men struggled against liberalism in the Northern Baptist Convention, they saw and they realized that they really weren't going to get anywhere with these liberals in the Northern Baptist Convention. The liberals had control. Every time they would try to move during one of the conventions to stem this tide of liberalism, they would get outvoted or voted down by other people within the Northern Baptist Convention. And after a period of time of these struggles, they began to realize this is not going anywhere. And so these men got together and formed some conservative organizations. They backed away from the Northern Baptist Convention and formed their own group. One of the most famous is the Baptist Bible Union, founded in 1923, which was a union of conservative men, fundamentalists within the Northern Baptist Convention that joined together to promote orthodox, conservative, theological orthodoxy. So be aware of the Baptist Bible Union, when it was formed, why it was formed. One of their leaders was Thomas Todd Hunter Shields, pastor of the Jarvis Street Baptist Church in Toronto, Canada, a very wonderful pastor, fundamentalist pastor and leader within the convention. And there were other leaders that promoted. Here's a good picture of him. He's called popularly T.T. Shields, Thomas Todd Hunter Shields. Also, during this period, J.N. Darby was preaching and teaching, his view of the Scriptures and dispensationalism and premillennialism. It was published, and Northern fundamentalists grabbed his theology and began to preach his theology, such as Riley and others. And so you have the emergence of dispensationalism and the popularity of premillennial theology. C.I. Scofield's Bible was published in 1909, which popularized premillennialism, and that was a big factor. Conservative leaders like J.C. Massey, Frank Goodchild, and John Roach Stratton got together and formed the Conservative Baptist Association of America in 1947. They thought they could stay within the convention and maybe work to try to turn the convention back. and so they wanted they still felt like they wanted to have some relations with the convention, so they formed the Conservative Baptist Association in 1947. William Bell Riley, J. Frank Norris, William Pettigill, R.E. Neighbor, and O.W. Van Osdale recognized that apparently they weren't going anywhere with trying to get the Northern Baptist Convention to go conservative, so they formed their own group. And in 1933, they dissolved the Baptist Bible Union and formed, and see if this sounds familiar, the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches, what we call the GARBC, which Piedmont has had a long relationship with. We've sent men out to pastor GARBC churches. We've sent missionaries out who are GARBC missionaries, and we do to this very day. We still participate in fellowship with churches and trained leaders in that organization, which is very popular in the Midwest. The GARBC is very big up in the Midwest in states like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, very popular there. And Illinois has GARBC churches too. So the conservative men formed the GARBC. After 1947, the American Baptist Convention trended more liberal. It continued to become more liberal, more emphasis on ecumenical the movement, more emphasis on the social gospel. Be aware of that. And biblical criticism became more prominent in schools, and they began to question the Bible and question the book of Genesis and things like that. Even Augustus Hopkins Strong got caught up in some of this. In this movement, we talked about Walter Rauschenbusch. Shaler Matthews was a Baptist professor at the University of Chicago, very liberal. Be aware of some of these liberal professors. Another popular liberal in the popular culture was Pastor Harry Emerson Fosdick, who pastored the Riverside Church in New York City, which was built by John D. Rockefeller with the money of John D. Rockefeller and at the desire of Rockefeller. Interesting that the richest man of America at that time was a Baptist, John D. Rockefeller, and he helped build this church in Riverside, and they called a liberal pastor Harry Emerson Fosdick. The reason Fosdick is so popular is he became one of the first popular media preachers, and he preached on the radio back in the golden days of radio back in the early 20th century. And he was a liberal, always professed to be a liberal, and he would preach and teach liberal doctrine there on his radio show, and had a national following here in the country of his radio broadcast. So he became one of the first big media figures in media as far as preaching, teaching. Harry Emerson Fosdick, very famous, but a liberal, and a Northern Baptist. Southern Baptists, after 1900, grew tremendously. They had grown very much in the 19th century. They continued to grow in the 20th century. And the Southern Baptists grew to become the largest denomination in America, which they are to this very day. And they've done that through evangelism, wonderful emphasis on evangelism and missions, very, very strong. They've conducted many campaigns to finance work in the missions and so forth, such as the cooperative program. Be familiar with that, and programs they have formed. But even the Southern Baptists were touched with liberalism. The Northern Baptist Convention pretty much started out liberal. The Southern Baptists had liberalism creep in through their schools, particularly their seminaries, and be familiar with how that happened. Be familiar with Professor Crawford Toy, who was a professor at Southern Baptist Seminary in the 19th century, and what he brought into the seminary, liberal ideas and the controversy that it created. Be familiar with him. J. Frank Norris was pastor of the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas, very conservative, firebrand conservative fundamentalist. He reacted against that and this liberalism coming in the Southern Baptist Convention, and became a spokesman among the fundamentalists in the Southern Baptist Convention. Be aware of Norris and familiar with Norris. Ralph Elliott brought higher criticism into Midwestern Seminary. Here's a good picture of J. Frank Norris. Be familiar with him. And be familiar with these men who in the 19th and early 20th century introduced liberalism into the Southern Baptist seminaries and the reaction that took place there. And Southern Baptists struggled with that for a number of years. It came into their schools in the late 19th century. They educated their pastors, their leaders, with these liberal ideas in some of their seminaries. They went out and began to preach and teach in churches liberal ideas, and that hurt the Southern Baptist Convention. And the Southern Baptist Convention was hurt spiritually because of the dissemination of liberal ideas, which we still see to this day. We still struggle today when we see around us, even here in North Carolina, liberal Southern Baptist churches. You know, we could name some for you, but I think you're familiar with some liberal pastors, liberal churches within the Southern Baptist Convention. Among Baptists in the latter part of the 20th century, there arose a big movement, which many of us who are older are familiar with, and that is the movement about the inerrancy of the Bible. And this was an issue to try to press and define what it is, what it means to be an Orthodox believer with Orthodox theology in regards to the Bible. You know, liberals have always claimed they believe the Bible and they teach the Bible, but obviously they don't believe everything that what we believe about the Bible. The inerrancy movement arose to try to push and define what that is, so that a line is drawn to define who is conservative and who is not, who is Orthodox and who is not concerning the Bible. And that was sparked by Harold Inzel in his famous best-selling book published back in 1976, The Battle for the Bible, and then his sequel to that was published just a couple of years later. And in this inerrancy movement, you had leaders such as Dr. Norman Geisler, J.I. Packer, John Gerstner, and others write and speak and get involved in this movement. The International Council on Inerrancy was formed in order to promote inerrancy, and that became a big influential movement in the 1970s, 1980s in America and in the world, defining inerrancy and what it means to be an inerrantist and believing an Orthodox view of the Bible. Very important movement that occurred, and this was spawned by Baptists. Harold Inzel, Norman Geisler, who has been a Baptist, and these men promoted that. Here's a good picture of Harold Inzel. Got a good picture of Dr. Norman Geisler. Another good man, J.I. Packer, conservative author, preacher, theologian. These men all promoted that. And the council met, stated, what the position was on inerrancy. There became a division among Baptists and others in America over this issue, particularly among Southern Baptists. And then we saw a movement in the latter part of the 20th century, which is a very important movement, which Piedmont is aware of because we've interacted with some of these leaders. And that is the movement of the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. That was something that I had the privilege to observe as a student at Dallas Theological Seminary. When I was a student at Dallas Theological Seminary, we heard that there was a movement in the Southern Baptist Convention to retake the Southern Baptist Convention and take it over and make it conservative. And I remember sitting down in the student center at Dallas Theological Seminary with other men and we discussing the issue, saying, oh, it'll never happen. There's no way that they're going to be able to take over the Southern Baptist Convention and make it, majority conservative anymore, because historically it had not been done prior to that except for the Lutherans. The Lutherans had pulled it off, but they had been the only group to go back into a denomination and retake the denomination and make it Orthodox again. That was just something that normally didn't happen. Usually when an organization goes liberal, it's gone. And so we didn't believe it could happen. But we observed, through seminary and even years later after we graduated, that they pulled it off. They actually pulled it off, and they were able to, through the Southern Baptist procedure of electing representatives to go to their convention, delegates, to have enough votes among conservative delegates at conventions to reshape the boards of institutions and make the Southern Baptist institutions conservative again, like their schools and seminaries. And they did it. They pulled it off. And two key men that were leaders of that were Judge Paul Pressler of Dallas, Texas, and Dr. Paige Patterson, who spoke here last year at Piedmont at our Stevens Lecture Series. So these were the two key men that led that movement. They started that movement. Dr. Paige Patterson was appointed president of two Southern Baptist seminaries. He went into Southern Baptist seminaries. He cleaned house on the liberals, got liberals moved out, hired Orthodox professors and turned seminaries around, like Southeastern Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina, Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, turned them around. And it was a very successful movement. Here's a good picture of Judge Pressler. Here's a good picture of Dr. Paige Patterson. So this is recent history, and we're familiar with this. They got Dr. Adrian Rogers involved, got him elected as a conservative leader of the Southern Baptist Convention. He appointed conservative board members to the various boards, such as schools and things like that. And this began this trend over 20 years of transforming the Southern Baptist Convention back into a conservative Orthodox institution, which succeeded and which has made the Southern Baptist Convention overall conservative today. And here's a good picture of Dr. Rogers, who's now with the Lord. So be familiar with that movement about the retaking over of the Southern Baptist Convention by conservatives, who was involved in what happened and so forth. But it's always been a struggle. It's always been a struggle to maintain orthodoxy and maintain the faith. And various issues have divided the Baptists over the years, and just, such as women being ordained and issues like that. The charismatic movement popped up among Baptists back in the 70s and was a divisive issue. So be aware of these issues that have been divisive issues among modern Baptists and those that have occurred. Changes in worship, so forth. Be familiar with that. Now, in the 20th century, there arose a movement among Baptists, both among Northern Baptist and Southern Baptist, the fundamentalist and independent Baptist movement. They were people that felt like they just had to get out of the conventions and be independent of all of these trends toward liberalism and these struggles going on in the big conventions, and they formed their own organizations. And so be familiar with that movement, how the independent Baptist movement arose, which Piedmont is a very big part of. We've been really big in the independent Baptist movement for years. Be familiar with that and who's involved, how that happened, and who some of the key leaders are. And you had men like the Northern Baptist, Baptist Bible Union formed, and now that came independent Baptists from that movement. The GARBC, independent Baptists have come from that movement too, out of that conservative movement. So be familiar with that movement and how it arose. The World Baptist Fellowship, some of those leaders, J. Frank Norris, his influence in this, the Baptist Bible Fellowship, G. Beecham Vick, and Baptist Bible College out in Springfield, Missouri, formed as a conservative Baptist college. And Jerry Falwell, of course, and Liberty University, which we're all familiar with, and many of us have studied at that school. Lee Robertson, who is a part of Piedmont, the history of Piedmont, who founded Highland Park Baptist Church in 1956, and Temple Baptist Seminary, which merged with Piedmont a couple of years ago and is now part of Piedmont. So Dr. Robertson's a very important part of that. Jerry Falwell, who founded Thomas Road Baptist Church and Liberty University and became a key leader in the independent Baptist movement there and has influenced even Southern Baptists. So be familiar with this man like Jerry Falwell. Dr. Lee Robertson, who's obviously involved in the history of Piedmont. Be familiar with this man and what they contributed in. Evangelist John R. Rice and his contribution to evangelism. A good picture of Dr. Rice there, who's with the Lord now. Dr. Robertson's with the Lord too, and Dr. Falwell. So the Baptists have played a very important part in the evangelization and establishment of churches in the world. Since the 17th century, they continue to exert tremendous influence in the world today. Baptists are ranked as the 6th largest Protestant group in the world, and Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant group within the United States. So Baptists are an important part of Christianity and church life. Baptists have a rich history and heritage and are a very diverse group in America and across the world. And through their influence, though their influence has diminished in Great Britain, Baptists continue to have tremendous influence in the United States and have played a very important role in Christianity and do continue to do so to this present day. It's great to be a Baptist. It's important to be a Baptist and be a part of the Baptist movement. Thank you very much.